Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hannah Olson. I'm the CEO of Disclo, and I'm super excited to be here today with three people who I'm very, very excited to chat with. I want us all to take a moment and imagine you're applying for a new job or you've just started a new role at a company, and you have a hidden illness that you feel really uncomfortable talking about. This could be something like anxiety, depression, addiction. Perhaps you're in the very early stages of a pregnancy. Very, very scary to go through that process. And unfortunately, that was my story. I started the workplace and was living with a very, very serious chronic health condition that required me to be hooked up to IV antibiotics for 8 hours a day, believe it or not, for almost 3 years, which, as you can imagine, was quite challenging, navigating the workplace and understanding how to go about those conversations. And I felt very anxious talking about this with my employer. Today, we're going to be talking about the fact that my story is not unique. And ultimately, there are so many people in this room affected by disability in one way or another, either personally or through a family member. But all of us have a story. We're all here. We all know someone. How can we not? Today, I'm joined by three people, again, who I look up to. We've got Holly Maloney, Managing Director at General Catalyst. We have Antonia Wong, who is DEI leader at Samsung Semiconductor, and we have Keith Sonderling, who is commissioner of the EEOC. So I'll let you all quickly introduce yourselves, and let's start with Keith, and we'll just go down the line.
Hi, everyone. I'm Keith Sonderling, commissioner at the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We are the regulator for HR, and everything we're going to be talking about today is under the Americans with Disability Act. And I do really want to thank you very much for having me. And, I talk a lot about reaching out to the HR tech vendor community and really dealing with innovators who are trying to solve a problem and help us with our mission at the EEOC to prevent and remedy employment discrimination and promote equal employment opportunity. And you had reached out a while ago, a couple years ago, thinking with this idea of how to help us very much with the interactive process. So I appreciate you and everything you're doing to help workers have a fair shake in the workplace.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Antonia Wong. I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion at Samsung, specifically at their Semiconductor subsidiary. And my journey really started with equity and fairness. I grew up in San Francisco and really started from a young age learning what inequity looks like, what does unfairness look like. That propelled me into an early career in legal and compliance. I worked as a paralegal for about a decade. And transitioned in-house leading diversity, equity, and inclusion really from this perspective of how do we help folks succeed, right? Most of us know that a lot of bias exists in our systems and things like that. So a big part of my mission and purpose is to really help companies find that fairness, make sure that we're leading from a people-first perspective, and doing what we can to improve the employee experience, and of course, for purposes of what we're talking about today, ensuring that we're covering our bases and making sure that we're not leaving out anyone in the process.
Hi, it's good to see so many faces this morning. I'm Holly Maloney. I'm a managing director at General Catalyst. We are a venture capital firm, so we invest at every stage from company formation to pre-IPO and everything in between. I co-run our healthcare investing team and strategy, where we invest around what we call our health assurance investment thesis. And we were early investors in sort of the first wave of delivering care into large self-insured employers. So companies like Livongo, now proud investors in companies like Disclo and Maven and Transcarent and others, as we look at that community as managing over $1 trillion of spend from a healthcare perspective and typically not set up to be run as healthcare organizations. So we're trying to figure out how can we invest in innovative solutions to help to manage care more effectively with the overarching goal of making healthcare more proactive, equitable, and driving better outcomes for societal benefit.
Thank you all so much again for being here. All of us in this room, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic changed things. It changed how we work, it changed where we work, and it also broadened our understanding of disabilities, and it brought mental health into this conversation, something that we didn't typically see as a disability, which now we're seeing more and more of, as I'm sure Keith is going to point out today. But we're all aware that there is a mental health crisis today in America, also globally, but specifically speaking today on the US. But what we're seeing is that now many people who hadn't actually considered themselves to be someone with a disability and weren't disclosing this at work are now coming forward and they're asking for help. They're realizing, hey, I fit into this definition too, and hey, I could qualify for support at work. And what's happening with that as well is we're starting to see a huge uptick in mental health related ADA charges. Keith, we'll kick it off with you. I know your colleague, Commissioner Lucas, actually in the fall, and I might be throwing you off with this, but she pointed out that over the last decade or so, there's been a significant increase in mental health related charges. Can you catch us up? What's going on
I want to
your
set
end?
the stage here of where employment discrimination is in the United States, and I'll try to make it a little more interactive. What do you think is the number one claim of employment discrimination in the United States? Anyone want to guess? You'll get a free Disclo hat. Age? Gender? Race? It's not none of those. So the number one claim of employment discrimination in the US is retaliation. And that's because it's added on, you go complain, I'm not being paid fairly. Yes, you are, and you're fired. So putting that aside, what is the actual number one claim of underlying employment discrimination? Disability, thank you. And so year after year, disability discrimination has been around 36% of all the cases we see. But what we've seen is a significant shift in those types of cases. When you normally historically in HR think about disability discrimination, what do you think about? An applicant who has a health issue, right? Or maybe missing a limb and needs some kind of adaptive device to be able to perform in the workplace. But in the last few years, we're seeing a significant shift of those claims moving from traditional disability claims, such as chronic illnesses, et cetera, to mental health. And that's really where the trends we're seeing, where everything is going. And it's really significant in the sense where mental health claims, and I'll break down in a moment what those are, it's almost a third of all disability claims. So you think about every type of disability out there, from diabetes to other heart issues, to limb issues across the board that you've dealt with in HR. Mental health is now a third of those. And at the EEOC, we define mental health claims coming in under anxiety, depression, PTSD, cumulative trauma disorder, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, and then a catch-all other of them. And what's really interesting in the sense, in addition to that, we also have, which is a whole nother topic, about alcoholism and drug use in the workplace, because that's a whole nother significant area that HR
I'd also throw
professionals
gambling into that issue, into that topic. I mean, it's true.
While we're in Vegas, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So in the sense what we're seeing with anxiety, depression, and PTSD are the bulk of those claims. It's almost 80% of those claims. And year after year, we're seeing them rise around 17 to 20% every single year. Cumulative trauma disorder in the last year increased 4,000%, right? So this is where a lot of the claims are going significantly. And this is a new era for HR professionals of how do you deal with this? Because before, you really come in significantly, you say, okay, this person has this medical ailment. We really have a playbook of how to do this. They need this kind of adaptive device. We know how to buy it. We know who the vendors are here. But when it comes to mental health, it's such a different equation because it's so different per individual employee. We both may have anxiety, but the accommodation request may be completely different of what we want to do. And obviously, the pandemic really has brought this to the front and center. And the real driver of a lot of these claims where HR departments are seeing now is the return to the office. I mean, that's really where we're seeing the influx of mental health claims. Because employees who are now being subject to these return to office mandates, right, for the first time, are now claiming that they can't come back in the office. And why are they claiming they can't come back in the office? There's really not a legal right to not come back in the office if you think about it. Before the pandemic, if you didn't come in on Wednesdays and Thursdays, you would be fired, right? In the sense where now everyone has gotten so used to working from home, and you're seeing a lot of big companies drive the employees to come back in the office, the accommodation they're requesting is saying, well, I have anxiety about returning to the office. I have anxiety about riding the subway, about crime, about the next virus I may count. And that is actually, now I'm claiming I'm disabled under the Americans with Disability Act, and you, employer, HR department, can't brush that off and just deal with these strong return to office mandates. So that's where we're seeing a lot of these trends come. It's being driven by a lot of the return to normalcy that HR departments mandates are, your bosses are requiring you to get everyone back in the office. But as we'll discuss, it's so critical to engage in that process to ensure that workers' rights under the Americans with Disability Act, whether it's for mental health or otherwise, to still go through that process. And that's where we're seeing a lot of these claims come, where the HR departments aren't even empowered anymore to go through that process because of these really strict return to office mandates.
Right, this is really a call to action for all of us. And Antonia, you're on the HR side, or in the, as an employer, and you've worked across several large-scale prominent organizations. I'm curious for you, how have you seen this impact evolve over time? And how has that impacted your approach to DEI and your DEI strategy, and also just your talent strategy as a whole?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing that stood out from what Keith shared is a lot of employers are trying to roll the clock back to 2019 rules. And I think that a lot of us are profoundly different. So I think from a DEI perspective, what I've seen are these really big shifts in how people want to work, where they want to work, how they want to show up, right? And so employers really have an opportunity to get in front of this. Sure, there's the compliance piece. We are legally required in many instances to help accommodate. But from a retention strategy, from an employee experience strategy, there are all these ways that we can help encourage folks to come in and have their best employee experience. Outside of a reasonable accommodation process, there's also this concept of what are we getting out of the employee, right? If you've experienced anything yourself, you know that you don't do your best work, right? Or maybe you're not focused, or you're not producing at the normal rates, right? And there aren't things inside the company that are legally required or that don't meet a certain criteria, but really you just want your employer to understand that you're having this human experience outside of work. And so I've seen a really big shift, and that is also, in my opinion, correlated with the generations, right? Gen Z joined the workforce in April of 2020. You remember what we were doing in April of 2020. And so we saw this in 2008, right? When folks were entering the workforce, millennials, during a time in our economy that was tough, right? So it really shapes what you look for in an employer. It shapes the kind of experience that you want. And employees are really paying attention to this. If anyone went to the Gen Z in the workplace session yesterday, that was something they talked about a lot, right? And so there are really important things that folks are looking for when they're looking for their companies, not their roles, their companies. They want to work for a company that's inclusive, that's understanding, that allows them, I'm not a fan of the bring your whole self to work phrase personally, but I think that what that means, the spirit of that is, I have stuff going on outside of here, right? And so people are building their jobs around their lives, and that's really different from what it was 5-10 years ago. So what I've seen internally are companies, leaders, often in Gen X and above generations, really struggling with the concept, particularly around mental health, because maybe there was a stigma when they were growing up, or maybe there's a cultural thing that's how it was in my family, where we don't talk about those things. And so I see a real struggle to understand, but also to validate people's experiences, right? And so that is the real opportunity, and the shift that I've seen in the DEI space is companies really needing to come forward and learn more about, their workforce, what people are looking for in an employee experience, and really taking opportunities to be proactive in how they are accommodating and showing those acts of inclusion.
That's awesome. And I know you've probably just seen so much change, and I know it's just going to continue to change. I do want to pause before I get to a question for you, Holly, and I just want to note that there is a QR code, so if anyone has any questions, I know we've got a jam-packed 30 minutes here, but if you do have any questions for us, we are taking live questions. And with that, Holly, I'm going to throw you off a little bit. Yeah. But we do have a live question, and I'm going to change it up a little bit. Someone asked around advice you have in the mental health investment space, but I'm going to change that up a bit, and curious as to why you focused so heavily on mental health investments and General Catalyst as a whole. Why? What is driving that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the reality is that we started to go deep in this work back in 2018. So well before you were reading in the headlines of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, like the mental health crisis that we're now faced with. Because it was clear back then, and we spent time with payers and providers to understand the landscape, what was available for people, why was it a topic that was not being discussed, because it was very clear that we were on the precipice of a crisis, because there were significant structural flaws in the way the mental health ecosystem existed. You know, you had no way to understand how to even think about care, a care pathway. How do you find high quality providers? How do you pay for those providers if you're lucky enough to find that and get on their calendar? And how would you know that that provider was best suited for you, depending on what it was that you were growing with, what your demographic makeup was, what your cultural orientation was? That was all a giant black box. I mean, I think growing up, I always thought about the quote therapy landscape as one that was for, you know, wealthier people that were, you know, paying for care in cash because they could afford it and have somebody to talk through their problems with. And so we just viewed that, first of all, we were in desperate need of solving two problems. One was the workforce transformation problem of how are you going to scale a declining workforce that was, again, on the precipice of being needed more than ever, and how were you going to enable individuals to find the highest quality care that they could access through insurance and have a tailored experience that was going to help them get whatever the definition of better may be. And then not only was there a clear understanding that sort of that personal journey needed to be solved for, but that also we were entering sort of a generational transition where you also needed to think about your dependents in both directions. So, you know, many folks are in what we call sort of the sandwiched caregiver position of having adolescents that are going through their own challenges and aging parents that are going through challenges, whether that's, you know, isolation and loneliness, you know, unfortunately, you know, Alzheimer's, dementia, you know, cognitive decline. All of those greatly impact that same individual that is seeking care themselves. And so how do we think about that full package and create a care model that can serve anyone who needs help? Because now, since COVID, after, you know, we've been doing this work really meaningfully, we're sort of in this good news, bad news situation of like good news that stigma has come down quite meaningfully. People are now more aware of when they may be faced with a mental health struggle, or they may be slightly more educated in how to identify challenges of loved ones, friends, colleagues. But we still are faced with these structural issues of how do you, so you know you have a problem, now what? How do you engage with the system? And how are we going to provide the highest quality providers the ability to scale themselves and serve higher quality care to more people? So there are just like, there are a lot of reasons why we've been focused on this. And, you know, at the end of the day, we'd love to have a system where mental and physical healthcare is more deeply integrated and we can think about a holistic care model, but we're still ways away from that. So there's still a tremendous amount of investment opportunity. And yeah, it's a long-term thesis that we're focused on.
So for whoever the founder was that asked about this earlier, that's your cue, maybe start building in this space. Keith, I wanted to first hear about how employers should handle this and what they should be thinking about. We also have a live question that you can probably touch upon in this answer as to what are you seeing as reasonable and what are you seeing as unreasonable? This is a very tricky question, by the way. Reasonable, the question of what is reasonable is very dependent, and I'm sure
there is no one-size-fits-all approach to disability accommodations.
And I know you'll have lots to say on this.
Which is why your job is very difficult, all of you in this room. But, you know, I really think when it comes to mental health, the kinds of requests we're seeing, you're just not used to, in the sense where we're saying, well, I have, PTSD related to the pandemic. The thought of having to come back in the office and stand and BS at the water cooler with my colleagues is giving me, anxiety that I don't want to have to come back in the office, right? If you think about a lot of these claims, again, going back to the return to the office, a lot of them, what is the accommodation the employees want? They want to work from home, right? So the fear of that being the ultimate accommodation is not always true. And that's why, I'm going to be very repetitive about the importance in engaging in this process. Because when you engage in this process, and we have a lot of guidance the EEOC has put out, and there's a lot out there at the Job Accommodation Network as well, that says, look, the ultimate request for an accommodation is always not going to be what the employee wants. So, everyone's going to want to work from home because they have anxiety, because they have depression, et cetera, related to returning to the office. But we have guidance out there saying, well, what type of anxiety do you actually have? And, that type of anxiety diagnosed by your mental health provider, maybe the accommodation may be coming in alternate hours, maybe giving noise canceling headphones, maybe be giving, dim light situation. The employees don't necessarily want to hear that all the time, but you've engaged in the process. And that is the most critical thing. The message you can take away from this is don't be afraid to engage in the process, because the employees are always not going to get what they want, and you're not going to be held to just giving them the request they want. Sometimes it may be the case. But another really important part I want you all to understand is, with the Gen Z workers and all that you're reading about, a lot of the claims may just sound absolutely ridiculous to you. They're starting to see claims about, well, I don't want to have my yearly performance review because I have anxiety, I'm going to be a bad rating, so I want an accommodation where I don't have a performance review. Think about that, right? I don't want to, I can't work on the weekend because it's giving me anxiety if you're going to give me another project to do, right? Just a fundamental shift of how work occurs. And as much as you may want to laugh at that, saying, get in the office and do your work, if it's going to come under a request for accommodation, don't forget these employees are telling you they're disabled under the Americans with Disability Act, right? They're seeking professional help. You just have to take that process serious, as ridiculous as it may sound to you, having been in the workforce for a while, and engage in that and go through the process and see what those accommodations always might be. And that's where we're seeing kind of differentiation. And one more part too, on the technology side, it's not just the younger workers, right? A lot of this is focused around Gen Z, but we're also seeing related to older workers as well, who are now, not to spend 4 hours on generative AI and job displacement, but look, there's a lot of anxiety and fear around using generative AI about older workers who've been doing their job one way for 20, 30 years, suddenly having to become prompt engineers. And that's also leading to claims of anxiety in the workforce as well. So you can't just think about it based upon one age group. It's really across the board, especially as you're requiring and integrating a lot of this AI technology and ensuring workers have accommodations to be able to use this technology as well. So it's really your entire workforce that's going to be involved in this mental health equation.
That's great. And you mentioned engaging in the interactive process. Real quick, if you can share with me, what is the first thing you look at when you get a charge and it hits your level at the EEOC? Are you looking at how the employer is engaging in that interactive process? What are you seeing there?
Well, the charges generally, I didn't get what I wanted and I had to quit and the employer didn't give me everything I asked for in that. What we're going to look at is, did the employer actually properly engage in that interactive process? Did they work with their medical providers as necessary? Did they go through and use resources like the job accommodation networks to see if the accommodation is actually fair? And look, the standard is under the Americans with Disability Act, can the employee with an accommodation perform the essential functions of the job? And that's what we're going to look at, see if you engage in that process to see what kind of accommodations were possible to get there, even though it may not be perfect for both sides. And if you can't get there because it creates an undue hardship, not to sound too much like a lawyer, but that's the standard here, then you're going to be off the hook if you're not able to do that. So it's really engaging the process. But here's the problem for all of you. There's no magic words under the ADA to engage in this process. So an employee, they don't have to use the words interactive process, the ADA buzzwords, right? You actually have a duty as employers to see if an employee is struggling, to approach them in HR to see, are you struggling because of a disability? And that's really where a lot of the trickiness. So it's really a holistic training for all your managers to see if somebody was a great performer and they're suddenly struggling, why? And you have to engage in that process as well. So a lot of the burden is on you.
That's great. And Antonia, I think, touching on that idea of preparedness and having a process and engaging in that process, quick plug, but you recently implemented our new tool for interview accommodations. And I'm curious, your perspective on considering accommodations and considering mental health all throughout the entire employee life cycle. Why are you thinking about this and how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, so I was very excited to find Disclo. I mentioned yesterday that I was searching up a company that does exactly this because I think that employers rather, can really get in front of this, right? A lot of what Keith is saying is, it talks about what we have to do. So I really use that as a springboard to introduce companies like Disclo, strategies that I can implement to really say, hey, look, we can get in front of this, right? And we can offer this really inclusive and fair employee experience. So bringing in, starting a reasonable accommodation program for candidates was something that I wanted to do on day one. I think every company should have it. If you don't have one, get after it. And it's really, the spirit of it is to help folks who need an accommodation and keep in mind that not everyone knows they need one or that they can have one, right? So there is this education piece to it.
But you're still liable, even if they don't know.
That's
if
right.
you know, or you see that, sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
but it's such an important point that all of you need to be aware of. A lot of times they may not even know, despite your training, despite your
That's
handbooks,
right.
but if you know, you're on the hook.
That's right. And so, so making sure that, so then there are folks that know, folks that don't know. And so the first opportunity is, how do we get the folks who know what they need a safe and sort of repeatable way to make their requests, right? The thing we struggle with most is, do I disclose? And if I do, can I trust the folks on the other end to be responsible with that information, right? And how many people will know? And so there's all those questions. And so sometimes we don't say anything and we just kind of bear through it and push through it. And we may not show up at our best because of that. So I really wanted to remove the work of that, the mental load of having to think through all those things. Using a tool like Disclo really allows this person to enter the accommodations process with a lot of safety and reassurance that the information is handled responsibly, that they have options, that they can talk freely about what they need. And then the other piece is helping to educate candidates and recruiters to say, hey, this is something that's available for everyone, anyone who may need one. We will definitely put you in the process and take a look. And sometimes, I mean, I've certainly scrolled through the list of things in my optional EEO surveys, and I'm like, oh, I actually not qualify, but that's not the right word, but I have a connection with something in here that I didn't realize was a disability. And so that education piece is important for candidates to know as they're looking for any role, that they have these options. So that's one of the strategies that we're really...
And I just have to add one important thing. I started out, the number one claim of employment discrimination is retaliation, right? And you brought up in this part, how can employees engage in this process to get that accommodation without the fear of retaliation when employers out there are retaliating, and that's the statistics we see.
Yeah.
And that's so much about the trust and the infrastructure around saying, I'm going to disclose some of the most personal information about me to my employer because my employer has a legal duty to do that. And how do I do that without the fear of being retaliated against, which is also illegal? So it's also building that trust and framework around
That's
this
right.
entire process.
Right.
Forget the legal side of it. It's the employee experience trust side, which you just really hit on.
Yeah, and I think it's the, again, bringing that generational piece into it, how people view mental health issues and illnesses is really going to inform the process, right? If someone says, like I've heard someone say, at a company that I used to work for a long, long time ago, well, we couldn't fit a wheelchair in this office, so why would I, and that's how nuanced these things can be, right? Or someone who doesn't understand anxiety or dyslexia, well, how could they code if they have dyslexia, right? And so it's not our job, and this is more, Keith's area, but it's not our job to decide.
Don't do that. Don't say that.
It's not our job to decide, right? Our job is to interact, engage in the process. On the inclusion side, it's getting in front of those things so that we don't find ourselves sort of against the corner.
Awesome. Real quick, I know we only have a few seconds here. Holly, can you just close us out and let us know why you think this is a good thing for companies to really think about mental health and accommodations and really invest in this?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that self-insured employers or any kind of employer are sort of inundated with point solutions around health and wellness benefits. And that's why, there's going to be really meaningful consolidation around these point solutions, and ROI is going to be scrutinized now more than ever. And I think there's, no better example of where ROI is very clearly understood than in the mental health space. It's really, really hard to find great people, convince them to join your company, and then keep them there. And so once you do the first two things, like, you need to optimize performance and really, take an appreciation for the surroundings. It's a pretty dynamic and intense world out there right now. And so, that's why I think it's incredibly important to think about and consider for any company.
And from the government perspective, this is not optional. You have to do this. So
Well,
we'll hold you to that.
Thank you all so much for being here and for all of you joining us. And I really want to just quickly thank as well Juliana and Jennifer for making this conversation as inclusive and accessible as possible. Thank you both so much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.